Hello, my name's Angela Sheard. I'm a curate in the Church of England, and my title parish is St Martin in the Fields, which is on Trafalgar Square at the heart of London. I've been asked to reflect a little bit for you as part of your summer school around my story, and so I thought I'd group this into three sections. I'd like to start off by talking a bit about my own context, where I'm coming from. What's the background for this story that I'm about to tell? I'll then talk a little bit about my story of vocation to ordained ministry, and finally, I'd like to pick out some emerging themes that have come from the story that I've shared with you. So, first of all, my context. And I think this is so important because everyone's story doesn't exist in isolation. Stories are told with a particular scene in mind, I guess, with a particular backdrop. And I think understanding that context is so important for getting a better sense of someone's story, for getting a sense of the scene on which the characters in the story play out. And so my own context is set in Tooting, southwest London. I grew up in Tooting and I spent my whole childhood there. I only left when I went to university when I was 18 years old. Both my parents lived with me in our family home in Tooting, and my parents come from different ethnic backgrounds. So my mum is Sri Lankan Tamil and my dad is white British. His family come from the northwest of England. So I'm mixed race or biracial, and I guess I found myself living in between two cultures and two communities for much of my childhood. My mum was quite an important figure within our local Sri Lankan Tamil community, and so I had lots of friends and other children that I saw from that community quite often at various social gatherings, and especially in our local church, which is something I'm going to talk a bit about later. But I also spent lots of time with people who are from a white British context, and I spent much of my childhood in between those two cultures, spending time with different groups of people and fitting in within different ethnic and cultural spaces. So I think this has given me a certain amount of fluidity and an ability to move between different environments. But this aspect of my life is not something that I really thought about much as a child. I can remember trying to work out what was the best box to tick on a census form, but apart from that, it didn't really occupy too much of my thoughts until later on in my life. And again, I'll probably come back to that later in my story. I'm originally from a Roman Catholic background, so I attended my local Catholic church and the primary school that was attached to my church. My my home church in that sense was a large Roman Catholic parish in Tooting. It was very ethnically diverse in terms of the congregation members, so we had large groups of the congregation who came from various countries around the world. So lots of Nigerians, lots of Ghanaians, lots of Filipinos, lots of people from Goa, which is in South India, and lots of Tamils as well, lots of Sri Lankan Tamils. Those are just some of the groups from around the world that made up my church. And I was in that environment all the time. My family was really active in my church growing up, and in particular, music was a big part of my life. So my mum was the local choir director, and I used to play piano and occasionally organ for her in church from the age of about, I think, 11 or 12 until I left home for university. The religious and cultural world of Catholicism was also a big part of my childhood. I think, again, this is something that I didn't really think about until later on in my life, but the rituals and traditions and customs from my religious background are something that have really shaped who I am today. And another thing to note about my Roman Catholic background is that, of course, there were no women priests. And the first time I really encountered women's ordained ministry was when I was at my university chapel, which was an Anglican chapel, where I encountered a female priest on a regular basis for the first time. So I guess that's kind of a link into my vocation story. And in order to understand my vocation story, I think it helps to understand my working life. at the point at which I felt called to ordain ministry. So after I left school, I went to medical school and I trained to become a junior doctor. Medical school was a really enriching experience for me. I loved being at university, meeting new people, developing a real passion for choral music actually at university. And in general, I loved the environment that was so open to understanding more about the lives of the people I was living and studying with, making new friendships, and generally kind of building connections. I thought university was a really special place for that. And also, I guess, the interplay of ideas. I loved being encouraged to think in new and different ways, and this really complemented the new people that I was meeting and the new relationships that I was forming. So I studied medicine, and I spent 6 years at university, and when I left, I started work as a junior doctor. I really loved my medical work, and there were two main reasons I think why I loved it so much. The first was this sense of being a bit like Sherlock Holmes. So I don't know if anyone's seen the kind of BBC, the TV adaptation of Sherlock, but when Sherlock Holmes is walking through a new place, there's all of these little kind of thoughts that come in on the screen, and you can see the observations that he's making and how he is assessing in and picking up the real nuances of the place that he's in and the people that he's with. And that's what enables him to eventually solve complex crimes and problems with no obvious solution. And I think in many ways medicine has similarities with that, because medicine is about diagnostics. It's about figuring out the patterns of illness that are in the person who's in front of you, the presenting person. So, and it's about paying attention to detail, about careful observation, about the patience that is required in order for the information to come into view. It's about asking the right questions and understanding how to facilitate a conversation in order to get the best possible picture of the person in front of you. It's about being able to examine someone in a way, such a way as to elicit information that you might otherwise miss. And it's about being able to put together the different pieces of information which don't always fit into a nice, neat picture, but about making a good judgment about the best way of putting together the information you've collected in order to reach a diagnosis, which is not necessarily the whole truth about what's going on with somebody, but which is the starting point for treatment and for trying to understand how to help the person that's come to you. So I really enjoyed that sense of being a detective, that sense of trying to solve quite complex diagnostic puzzles and trying to use the scientific training that I'd had over so many years at medical school, trying to put it into practice to make a real difference to people's lives. So that was the first thing that I loved. But the second thing for me was really getting to know people. And I often would quote at this point a job that I had in my second year as a doctor in community psychiatry, which was a very memorable job and probably my favourite job actually. So I used to rotate every 4 months through very different medical and surgical specialties. But community psychiatry was something that I absolutely loved, partly because I ended up having my own clinic and I would have initial appointments with patients which were a whole hour, where I'd start off with not very much information about them quite often, and I'd just be in a room with that person and have an hour to figure out what was going on in their minds. But the reason I enjoyed that time, I think, was because that hour was an opportunity to get to know them as a person. And I often found the process of getting to know them as a person provided information that helped me in terms of diagnosis and treatment that I wouldn't have received if I was approaching them as purely as a diagnostic problem. Um, Rather than seeing them as a problem, I tried to get as coloured and as nuanced a picture as possible of who is that person sitting in front of me. And so I'd open up some space, or I would try to, and maybe the first 45 or 50 minutes of that hour was a case of opening up space and encouraging that person to step into the space and show me who they are. And that was really exciting. It was great to sort of see what it's like to really get myself out of the way in the conversation and try to pick up on things which interested that person and try to build a rapport and a relationship to create quite an organic, fluid conversation that flowed through different subjects that were important to that person. What I didn't love then about my job was definitely the long hours it involved and sometimes the unpredictable shift patterns, but also I think this huge responsibility for human life that doctors hold in their hands, even from the time when they leave medical school. And I think it's an enormous responsibility and an enormous weight that can be on your shoulders, which is quite hard, especially in the first years, I think, of working as a doctor, to understand how to hold that weight. The fact that you do make life or death decisions, the fact that you're responsible for what you do in those moments, and that things which could be honest mistakes can have a real impact on someone's life, even though you never intended to cause harm. And I think that is a really difficult thing to come to terms with. So that's a bit of the kind of working context for my vocation story. When I felt called to ordain ministry, I was working as a junior doctor. But there's another important element to my vocation story and the backdrop to it, which is a crisis that I had around my sexuality. In my early 20s, I fell in love with my best friend completely out of the blue, and I took a real kind of leap of faith. It felt like jumping off a diving board, I guess, into the deep end, and I entered into a relationship with her. At this point, I hadn't really thought about my sexuality before, and I didn't really feel like I had anyone I could talk to about it. So I made an appointment with my university counsellor, and she suggested that I have a look online and see if there's any LGBT Catholic organisations out there. And at the time, I sort of thought, oh, there won't be anything. But I Googled it, and there was something in London. The Jesuit church in Mayfair called Farm Street has an LGBT Catholic chaplaincy for young adults. And so I would often go to London from my university to visit that chaplaincy and to go to Mass with them. And over a number of years, that place was the focal point for a journey of healing for me, and a time when I was really understanding my faith in a new way. There were lots of new ideas, and there was a sense in which this was a culmination of the process of me owning my faith for myself, a process that had begun, I think, really in my late teenage years, of me kind of questioning the faith that I'd inherited from my mum, and of me kind of asking, what does faith actually mean for me? I chose to stay in the church, partly because I knew that the church had done me so much good in my life. Even during times when I questioned what I believed, I kept on going to church Sunday by Sunday. I loved singing in the choir, and that was probably something that kept me in the church. But I also had this real sense in which church was working something good within me that I couldn't really explain or articulate. But I think especially the sense of receiving communion every week, I could really tell that it was doing me some good, and so I kept going. And I think that was a really important factor in this whole journey of owning my faith for myself, of remaking, and all of my questioning around my sexuality was a real culmination of all of that. And I emerged with an inclusive Christian faith that I think was an essential starting point for what came next in terms of my journey of vocation. So, in 2017, in the summer of that year, I just happened to be in London around London Pride. I was probably staying with my parents, and I decided to go into the centre of the city and support the LGBT group that I met at Farm Street. And they were handing out flyers for Christians at Pride, which was an ecumenical service at St James's Piccadilly, which is an Anglican church. And I went into the service, and the priest was lifting up the bread for communion, and I was just sitting in the pews. And all of a sudden I was like, that's what I want to do with my life. I had this moment of laser-like clarity that I don't think I've really had to that in that degree before or since. But in that moment, I knew that what I wanted to do in life was to be a priest, to be ordained. And this was a huge thing for me, partly because, as I've mentioned before, the Roman Catholic Church doesn't have women priests, so it was quite a big conceptual leap, actually, for me to make. But that moment really kick-started a discernment journey, which lasted 2 years, and I did that while I was attending St James's Piccadilly, so I made that church my home church after visiting it for London Pride. And I was received during those 2 years into the Church of England from the Catholic Church, and at the end of those 2 years I got through national selection, or BAP as it was known then, and I went to train at the Queen's Foundation in Birmingham in 2019. So fast forward 3 years, which was quite a big 3 years because we had the COVID-19 pandemic during that time and all of the lockdowns and disruption which that involved. But fast forward, and 5 years after that initial experience during Pride in 2017, I was ordained deacon at St Paul's Cathedral during the London Pride weekend of 2022. So an enormous journey over the space of 5 years. And it was quite moving to me to be ordained 5 years after my initial experience with the same sort of feeling in London during the Pride weekend. But equally moving for me actually was to have that the opening hymn in my ordination service, which was "The Church's one foundation is Jesus Christ, her Lord," and that really moved me because, as somebody who was moving denomination and someone who has spent so much of my life in a different denomination, I think the ecumenical vision is really important for me, and that sense of the Church's foundation being not a particular denomination or a particular theology necessarily, but being Jesus himself, I think was enormously important for me, and I found it really moving to walk into the cathedral singing that hymn. So, after my ordination service as a deacon, I began my curacy at St Martin in the Fields, and I've currently done 2 years of that. I was ordained as a priest 1 year ago, and so I continue at the moment my ministry at St Martin's, which I find enormously enriching, not without its challenges, but a really exciting and dynamic place to start my ordained ministry. So I guess I'd now like to talk briefly about some emerging themes which for me have come out of this process of reflecting on my own journey, on the context for it, and on the direction that my vocation has taken me over the years so far. There's 3 themes that I want to briefly touch upon. The first one is this sense of defining categories of human identity, especially around race, in terms of being multiracial, and also in terms of sexuality. I guess I would identify as bisexual, but I think I feel more comfortable in some ways talking about myself as a queer person in ways which go beyond sexuality. Queerness in the sense of transgressing or defying systems of classification of human identity and experience that we've inherited. There are so many of these classification systems, race, sexuality, gender just being some of them. And I think there's a sense in which I feel like someone who sits outside of those systems, but also as someone whose very existence challenges the assumption that those systems are able to completely describe human beings. This queerness then has brought lots of blessings to my life, but also has brought times of real struggle, and there have been times in my life when I found myself wrestling with the expectations of other people that I should sit within those classification systems and not outside of them. That expectation has come over in different ways from people in my family, people in my church, and from wider society as well. And so, in addition to being a great blessing, I think it's also been something that has brought me a lot of pain over the years. But for all of that, for all of the struggle, I wouldn't change that journey that I've been on, and I really value all of the time that I've spent wrestling with the ways and the normative ways of describing human identity, and the journey which is ongoing, I think, of embracing my queerness. So that's the first theme. The second theme is one of exploration and adventure. Especially in my vocation journey, I think I really enjoyed exploring new communities and encountering new people and ideas. I trained at the Queen's Foundation, which is ecumenical, so I trained alongside Methodists as well as Anglicans from different parts of the church. And this was something I found really enriching. I loved encountering completely new theological perspectives that have transformed my understanding of how God relates to the world and which continue to do so. And I love that sense in which this encounter with new things, with new perspectives, people, ideas, and that sense of adventure is something ongoing. It never stops. And I think that's, for me, how theology and how ministry has to be, because God is the ultimate unknowable. And we spend our whole lives, I think, sometimes in the church as disciples, on that journey, on that adventure to try to glimpse some more of God's glory and how all of that is being worked out in our world. But I really love that. I really love the exploration and I love the adventure, never knowing what I'm going to encounter next. And the third theme that I think has emerged is something around a transition from a focus on science to a focus on story as a way of understanding people. So I started out in my medical career as someone who was really interested in science. I was really interested in neuroscience, especially when I first arrived at medical school and in my first few years of study. And I think over my time in medical school, and especially when I was working, I transitioned slowly to focusing on the importance of story. So I mentioned my community psychiatry job and that sense of trying to understand people by spending time listening to them and their stories. And I think that transition has continued as I've gone into ordained ministry, because I love in my job at the moment pastoral conversations and the chance to really center story as a way of understanding not only people, but as a way of understanding the world, as a way of understanding God's relationship with the world. And theology as story is something that I find incredibly powerful and something that really inspires me as an ordained minister, as a priest, and as someone who tries to understand and communicate something of God's ongoing relationship with our world. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope this is a good starting point for your own conversations and for you exploring further your own stories. Thank you very much.